Hi, everybody. Welcome to my capstone presentation. I'm Alexandra Schrader, and I'm so excited that you're tuning in to my capstone today. Before we get started, I would just like to mention that I will be talking about trauma-related topics. So initially, I wrote a paper on gender violence in the media with a specific emphasis on how does gender violence appear in everyday media. So before we get started, I would like to define gender violence. Gender-based violence refers to all harm inflicted or suffered by individuals on the basis of gender differences and is influenced by gender norms, in which I'll talk about a little bit later down the presentation. So something that is a misconception in today's society is that gender violence is always physical. However, it can be emotional as well as physical. And I have a little wheel that specifically points out all the different tactics that would be considered gender violence. So there's emotional abuse, there's isolation, intimidation, using children, minimizing, denying, and blaming, sexual abuse, using male privilege, using economic abuse, and using coercion and threats. So during this presentation, I'm going to talk about how media plays a role in enforcing gender norms and how we are so distracted in our society to notice the little subtleties of gender violence in whatever media platform we are on, movies, ads, commercials, TV series, etc. And I will be talking about the very popular series on Netflix that is now streaming called You. So these are the different objectives that I want to accomplish during this presentation. I want to discuss the different components of gender violence. I want people to understand how gender violence appears in everyday media, what makes this kind of content so widely accepted in our society today. And I am going to be specifically, as I said before, analyzing the Netflix show You as an example. So history of media. Okay, so in the 1950s, that was a huge decade of change. This was post-World War II, where women were starting to come back from the workforce and live back at home. And so family was a really big, important element of life at that time. So popular sitcoms were a thing that families, in the evening would sit down and watch together. So pop culture really started to take off, and the media put a lot of attention on kind of like the perfect family where the woman would stay home and be the caretaker of the house and provide for her husband who was, off at work. So my literature review is divided into 3 sections: gendered media, male masculinity in the media, and media in our society today. And all of this wonderful information comes from these wonderful scholars that study the world of communications and the different components of gender violence, gender media, and stereotypes. So the first 2 scholars that I found, Julia T. Wood and Maria Jacobson, have a lot of research on gendered media and stereotypes. And from this research, they conclude that media is the most influential source regarding our perceptions on gender, which would make sense because we are surrounded by media at all times of day. When we wake up, we check our phone. During the evening, we might turn on the news and watch what's happening in the world. So media is all around us, and that's how we form a lot of our ideas, a lot of our perceptions about things. Information can be interpreted through appearance, attitudes, interests, behavior, psychological characteristics, relationships, and occupation. So another word for this would be there's a lot of symbols in media that tell us the way how we should look. If we identify as female, maybe we need to look beautiful and cover up our flaws using this makeup, versus ads that tell men and young boys how to look manly, what to play with, and how to look strong. So because of this, it has a lot of negative impact on people, and it results in emotional withdrawal, a lack of creative freedom, discrimination, and abuse that is usually catered towards women. So Maria Jacobson, the scholar that I previously mentioned, did research on how females are portrayed in the media versus how males are portrayed in the media. So females, there's a big emphasis on appearance, sexuality, relationships, in traditional gender roles, like I have previously mentioned. They are portrayed as sexually attractive to gain the approval of others and to keep the peace and defer to men. By that, I mean women are portrayed as supposed to being very like submissive to men, and if they speak out or give their opinion, then they are considered too emotional, too dramatic, or even to some extent that they have some kind of mental issue. Males are portrayed in the media as very attractive, usually very muscular. They're dominant over females, very aggressive, urgent, insatiable, relentless, and oftentimes heterosexual. So I talked a little bit more about the plot in my paper, but since I have limited time, I will just give a little brief explanation of the show. So Joe Goldberg is the main character of the show. And it is based in New York. He works at a bookstore and becomes infatuated with this one woman named Bex that walks in because she comes in a lot to grab books since she is a graduate student. And from this, he becomes quickly obsessed with her, finds out her personal information, and we just kind of follow him along during this journey and get to hear all his inner thoughts in his head. So I chose this show specifically to talk about gender violence because Joe is the perfect example of the embodiment of toxic male masculinity. So he comes off as this really handsome and arrogant player that, attracts all these ladies and kind of is very cocky, knows that he can go to any lady and pretty much persuade her to date him. So Joe reinforces male stereotypes by asserting force and control over women. And he is a sociopathic stalker who manipulates his victims into loving him. So I have actually watched this show before, and these are the different components of gender violence, as you could see, like from the wheel that I showed earlier, that I found throughout the show. So first one is stalking. So from the first time he meets Bex, he Googles her and finds her on social media, and he finds out her personal details like her address just through geolocation on her photos. So due to this, he knows every single place in every single specific minute of where she's at all times. He also watches her from outside her window because she often keeps her window open throughout the show. The second is narcissistic tendencies. So as I said before, Joe's the main character. And so throughout the whole show, his internal monologue is voiced for the viewer to follow along with. So we hear a lot of his very disturbing thoughts. Some of these thoughts include, you need somebody to save you, and nobody's ever going to love you like I do, Bex. The third component is jealousy and isolation. So Joe separates Bex from any other men and her friends. So previous to Bex committing to Joe in a full-blown relationship, she's actually dating somebody named Benji, and Joe ends up befriending Benji just to get closer to Bex, and then ends up murdering him. And Bex has no idea that he has passed away. She just hasn't heard from him. And we are also introduced to Bec's best friend Peach, and Peach starts to notice that wherever Joe goes, there's a lot of red flags. And so Joe ends up befriending Peach just as he did with Benji, and ends up murdering her and framed it on her as she got into a situation where she ended her life. And then the last and most obvious sign of gender violence was the physical abuse. He physically abuses the woman in the show, and then unfortunately he actually abuses his own love interest and murders her because she starts to realize that all her friends and family, she doesn't really have anybody since she has been with Joe. She notices that Joe is very suspicious and that he contributed to their deaths. And so she starts to question him, and he ends up murdering her because he realizes that she sees the person that she's dating is not the person that she met in the first place. It was all a show. So media in today's world. So there are millions of other characters that are like Joe in a lot of movies, for example, 50 Shades of Grey, that are romanticized, a type of love that is romanticized, and it is very abusive. It has multiple components of gender violence, but these kind of characters are what people are so drawn to because that's what we have grown up watching. We've grown up watching so many different shows where there's a power imbalance between men and women. So there's gradual changes in media's depiction of gender roles, but the ideals are still present. And a lot of streaming services offer lots of movies and shows that focus on this power imbalance between men and women. And the depiction of females in the media lapse into sexist relegation, while male figures are often eroticized and shown for their abilities, while women are often shown for their bodies. And, everything is always out of proportion. Women's bodies, like bigger chest. And like the goal is like to show the woman as, oh, she is an object that is submissive to her male partner. For discussion, so this show has become very, very popular just because there's so much controversy within the show. So over 43 million people have viewed this show and have romanticized this twisted love story, which in reality it is not a love story, but instead a really horrific example of some of the dark-rooted issues in our society today. In fact, I am on multiple social media platforms, and I have seen for myself that there's a lot of young women in the world who romanticize this kind of character who is very abusive to their partner and then ends up murdering her. And that is a huge problem today because people never look at anything that these type of characters do is morally wrong. Instead, they think, oh, this guy is so passionate, this partner is so passionate that they'll go through any sort of circumstance, they'll go lengths just to win the girl over. And they dismiss it as violence, but instead categorize it as an act of love. So in conclusion, we spend a lot of our time on different media platforms, but we don't really think about what is being shown to us. In fact, we continue to support gendered media and gendered stereotypes. Gender violence is all around us in drastic ways, but it's also very subtle ways that have been accepted by our society as normal. So it's up to you to really think about what you're watching. I just want to say thank you so much for tuning into this presentation, and thank you to my wonderful professor, Dr. Justin Eckstein, for leading us on this capstone journey. And over here, you'll see that these are some resources for victims and survivors to utilize. Thank you so much, and here's my resources.